Greetings and a warm welcome to the latest episode of Australia-China Media Watch. This is episode 15, when we're looking at articles from the Global Times and what they are saying about Australia from Monday, February 21st to February 27th, 2022. That's a Sunday. And contrasting that with what Sky News Australia is writing about China. We'll begin by unpacking the Global Times. During the course of the week, there were 22 mentions of Australia in the Global Times. Let's begin unpacking. The first article in question is entitled, Japan Fans China-Aussie Flame to Seek Advantage. This was found in the Observer section of the Global Times, with no author indicated, published February 22nd, 2022 at 11:36 p.m. The opening paragraph of the article reads, "When it turns out that Australia is staging a self-directed farce with its laser attack allegation against China, Japan has chosen to stand on the erroneous side of the incident." According to Australian media, Japan's ambassador to Australia, Yamagami Shingo, openly backed Australia in its latest confrontation with China and said his country was fully behind Australia on this matter. The remarks came even after China refuted Australia's hype that a Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy vessel pointed a laser at its patrol aircraft and revealed the fact that the Australian patrol aircraft operated near the Chinese vessel flotilla with a minimal distance of only 4 kilometers and dropped sonar buoys around Chinese ships. It was only after Australia made those provocations that China carried out safe, standard, and professional actions. We'll take a closer look at further mentions of Australia in the article, and it looks like it appears multiple times. We keep going, and the next paragraph reads, "With the Japanese envoy offering one of the first public expressions of support to Australia since the incident, Japan has chosen geopolitics over truth and justice." Da Zhigang, director of the Institute of Northeast Asian Studies at Heilongjiang Provincial Academy of Social Sciences, told the Global Times that Japan wants to tag China as the provocateur of the laser attack incident as a way to smear China. The Japanese ambassador is sending a message to the international community that China exacerbated regional tension first, and by doing so, Japan aims to inject firmness to Australia's anti-China crusade and pour oil on the China-Australia flame. This is exacerbating regional tension, said Da. This time, a Japanese diplomat voiced Japan's support even ahead of his US counterpart. Da believes that either it is because the US didn't think the incident was relevant to its own interests, or that the US is too busy grappling with what's happening in Ukraine. But since Japan acts as a microphone of the US on many occasions, Japan's stance reflects that of the US-Japan's intention. Japan's stance reflects that of the US. Japan's intention to smear China and stir up regional tension fits perfectly into the US's Indo-Pacific playbook. As vanguards of the US's China containment strategy, Japan and Australia have moved closer in recent years. Both have taken part in the same multilateral military exercises, are members of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and have become quasi-allies after signing the Reciprocal Access Agreement in January. The subtext of all these crafty maneuvers is China, a so-called circle of values comprising these like-minded countries, is nothing but a gang of interests. The words of Shingo reflect a hawkish, bellicose, and containment mentality, and this is not the first time that he rushes to the fore In March last year, ahead of the first leaders of Quad, the diplomat said Canberra is not walking alone in dealing with an increasingly aggressive China as Japan has experienced 10 years ago. In July, he spoke up again, applauding the way Australia has resisted economic pressure from China. He even went further by saying countries like Australia, Japan, and the US have to get together to address challenges caused by China. Da told the Global Times that deliberately uttering hawkish statements against a third country goes beyond the responsibility and norms of a diplomat. Japan's containment mentality has become normality. Japan deeply knows it is not able to compete with China alone, so it pins high hopes on the US and its allies. The deep intertwined economic interests between China and Japan and their common interests in multilateral frameworks such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership make Japan walk a tightrope. It doesn't want to come to an open break with China, so it voices out by taking advantage of the conflicts between China and other countries. Such calculating moves may bring Japan some temporary petty geopolitical interests, but potentially risk future ties with China. Based on this initial impression, number one, is it constructing Australia as a negative and repulsive other? I think the answer is yes. And on top of that, is it bunching together a group of countries, drawing a line in the sand? The answer to that is a yes as well. And for that reason, I'd like to make the argument that this article is representing and constructing Australia in a clearly negative and repulsive manner. We'll move along to the next piece. Found in the diplomacy section of the Global Times, this next headline reads, China handles complex Ukraine crisis with caution and principle. The article is authored by Yang Sheng, the chief reporter of the Global Times covering Chinese politics, diplomacy and military, Chen Qingqing, co-lead of the Global Times China desk, as well as Fan Anqi. Originally published February 22nd, 2022 at 9:17 p.m. and further updated February 23rd, 2022 at 2:44 p.m. The article is accompanied with a photograph, and the captions of the photograph reads, The United Nations hold an emergency meeting on the Ukraine issue at United Nations headquarters in New York on February 21st, 2022. The opening paragraph of the article reads, The Ukraine crisis sees new change as Russia has decided to recognize two regions in eastern Ukraine as quote-unquote independent and sovereign states. And the UN Security Council has met on the issue, with China calling on all parties to continue dialogue and consultations and seek reasonable solutions. The situation shows that Russia has seen through the weakness of the West, led by the US, and decided to take more direct actions to push the US and NATO to respond to its security concerns. And by recognizing the two regions as sovereign states, Russian forces would be able to enter the regions openly. The United Nations Secretary General called for the peaceful settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine in accordance with the Minsk agreements as endorsed by the Security Council in Resolution 2202 back in 2015. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia in the article, and it looks like it appears once. I'll backtrack one paragraph to provide a bit more context. Cui Hongjian said, We believe that the most urgent task at the moment is to urge relevant parties to talk and not to have any conflict. Second, Russia and Ukraine could actually solve the problem face to face. Third, the West, especially the US, should stop further intensifying the tension by making further military deployments and imposing more sanctions. Most major Western powers, including the US, the UK, the EU, Canada, Australia, and Japan, have condemned Russia's latest move and claim that they will impose new sanctions against Moscow. In the section, What's Next? The next paragraph reads, the situation in eastern Ukraine is undergoing major changes, the Chinese embassy in Ukraine said in a statement on its website on Tuesday. The Chinese embassy in Ukraine reminds Chinese citizens and Chinese-funded enterprises in Ukraine to pay attention to the safety notices issued locally and not go to the unstable regions. Chinese experts predicted that an all-out war is still unlikely as the massive military operation will cause the situation to be going out of control, so the conflict might focus in the specific regions rather than expand to the whole country. What the West could do is very limited, and the US prefers increased military deterrence against Russia, but that is not what the EU wants. In terms of what sanctions would be imposed on Russia, Western countries will coordinate to reach a final conclusion. Based on this initial impression, I think I'll make the argument that Australia is represented in a somewhat negative light, bunching Australia together rather with the US, the UK, the EU, Canada, as well as Japan, suggesting that such action could further intensify the tension. With that in mind, we'll move along to the next article. This next piece comes with the headline, Australia's Antarctica plan stems from its hostility toward China. It's pretty clear from the headline already how this article is being positioned. Let's continue to unpack the article itself. This was written by Wang Yi, February 22nd, 2022 at 7:05 p.m. The opening paragraph of the article reads, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced a $804 million funding plan to expand the country's presence in the Antarctic. As Morrison continues to whine about the threat of China ahead of a looming federal election at the country, he seemed to have directly tied the Antarctic plan to Australia's national security, according to Sky News Australia. As the relationship between China and Australia continues to spiral down due to Morrison's fiery and provocative rhetoric and actions, I'm going to pause right here just to reflect on what's being said. I think it's pretty apparent from the way this article is positioning its relationship with Australia is that Morrison seems to be the causal reason why such a downward spiral has taken place. A very clear case of finger pointing. Moving along back into the article. The Western media outlets widely view Australia's Antarctica funding announcement as a big move by Canberra to counter China's growing influence in Antarctica. A week before Australia decided to increase funding commitments to strengthen its Antarctic presence, the Lowy Institute, a Sydney-based think tank, published a report named Eyes on the Prize, Australia, China and the Antarctic Treaty System, also known as the ATS, claiming that China pushes the boundaries of the ATS. In fact, China has always abided by the provisions of the ATS in carrying out scientific expeditions in the Antarctic region. It is not difficult to detect that some Western think tanks, such as the Lowy Institute's hype about China's increasing assertiveness in Antarctica, is full of speculation and conspiracy. Such false conjecture may provide material support for the Morrison government's anti-China agenda, but it is actually paranoia originating from their hostility toward China. Given the mutually beneficial and complementary economic and trade relations and friendly people-to-people exchanges between China and Australia in the past many years, it is really difficult to understand where the hostility of the anti-China forces in Australia came from. Yet, the Morrison government has embraced serving as the pawn of the US government's anti-China geopolitical game in recent years. From the South China Sea to the Taiwan question, Canberra constantly jeopardizes China's core interests driving the bilateral relations toward a dead end. The sad reality is that the Australian government is pleasing the US at the expense of the Australian business community. In this instance, what might make the argument, the article is attempting to drive a multi-pronged wedge within Australia. The domestic politics as well as the business community, even questioning the saliency and accuracy of the Lowy Institute. Moving along with the article, the paragraph continues to state, according to a report by the Australia-China Relations Institute of the University of Technology Sydney, also known as the UTS, in December, the value of Australian exports to China affected by China-Australia dispute fell by $17.3 billion in the first 9 months of 2021 from the corresponding period of 2019. Australian politicians know well that China's legitimate scientific expeditions in the Antarctic region are not challenging its national security by any means. Using the so-called geostrategic panic as an excuse, they are actually pushing their own self-serving agenda. An article published on the Financial Review on Monday said that Australia is using the $800 million injection to fight a cold war against China and Russia in the Antarctic region. The rest of the paragraphs looks at the breakdown of how that $800 million will be spent. Moving along to the concluding paragraph that reads, bringing the outdated Cold War mentality to Antarctica, Australia will only fall into another confrontation trap of its own making. However, it must be pointed out that China's economic strength continues to grow. China will fully protect its legitimate scientific expeditions in the Antarctic region and cooperate closely with other countries. Australia's hostility will ultimately backfire on itself. Pretty apparent, I think. In this instance, a very clear-cut case of an othering offensive. Australia is indeed constructed as not only a negative and repulsive other, but this line in particular caught my eye. And that's kind of the first time I've come across this from my keeping track of the Global Times over the last 3 months. And this is the line in question. Bringing the outdated Cold War mentality to Antarctica, Australia will only fall into another confrontation trap of its own making. With that said, we can move along to the next piece. The next article was found in the Opinion/Global Minds section of the Global Times, written by Robert Lawrence Kuhn, chairman of the Kuhn Foundation and recipient of the China Reform Friendship Medal in 2018. The headline reads, "Look to history to inform China-US relations today." The opening paragraph of the article reads, "For those of us disheartened by the sorry state of Sino-US relations, the 50-year anniversary of former US President Richard Nixon's surprise visit to China in 1972 offers an opportunity for reflection and perhaps a chance for hope. Can looking back 50 years inform Sino-US relations today? What can we learn from the historic breakthrough, coming as it did after more than 20 years of animosity, when China and the US were outright enemies, a protracted period that hit rock bottom during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, when Chinese and American soldiers fought fierce, bloody battles, some of them hand to hand. I'm going to present some principles underlying and driving that long-ago diplomatic triumph that transformed Sino-US relations then, and suggest how they may offer fresh ideas for transforming Sino-US relations now. Let's take a closer look at mentions of Australia in the article, and it looks like it appears twice in the following paragraph. And this paragraph reads, "Chinese majorities believe the US is dedicated to containing China and stopping its rise. This is the real reason, they say, why America supports Taiwan. not as a paragon democracy, but as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which the US can use to threaten China while keeping the motherland divided. They see America building alliances to preserve its hegemony by surrounding China with the Quad, US, Japan, India, Australia, and AUKUS, Australia, UK, and the US, also with South Korea, Philippines, even Vietnam. The US hacks into China's computers and sends endless spy planes to patrol its shores. The US foments extremism, separatism, and terrorism in Xinjiang and Tibet, trespasses with naval force into China's sovereign territory in the South China Sea, interferes with China's internal affairs by stirring up rebellion and violence in Hong Kong, maliciously blames China for the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, spreads false rumors and smears China, applies the long arm of American law against China's interests anywhere in the world, and tries to inject Western values to overwhelm Chinese culture, eroding China's independence and undermining its sovereignty. I think it's fair to say, based on this impression, that Australia is not represented in a positive light. The article may not have been directed towards Australia, but what it's doing over here is bunching Australia together with these groups of countries that run counter to China's independence and sovereignty. So would this qualify as a case of othering offensive? I think it's a crystal clear yes. With that in mind, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 22nd of February 2022 at 5:56 p.m. is the article with the following headline: Hong Kong submits application to join RCEP, will boost trade and economy, according to an official. No author is provided in this instance, and the article was found from the economy section of the Global Times. The opening paragraph of the article reads: The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, the SAR, is kicking off a discussion about joining the RCEP after submitting an application in mid-January. Brian Lo Sai Hung, Director General of Trade and Industry, said on Monday. At present, total trade volume between Hong Kong and the RCEP economies stands at $962.6 billion, of which the total service trade volume accounts for $103 billion, according to local media reports. Hong Kong has favorable conditions to join the RCEP and can play a synergistic role to strengthen trade ties and links, between the RCEP member economies, Lo said at an online meeting. He said that Hong Kong may join the RCEP about 18 months later, according to local media reports. Australia is mentioned once in this article in a descriptive manner, highlighting its role as part of the members of the RCEP, and the paragraph reads: The RCEP currently has 15 members, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and 10 ASEAN countries. If calculated by the number of population, economic size, and trade, they all account for about 30% of the global total. The RCEP came into effect for 10 countries, including China, on January the 1st. Based on this initial impression, I think I'd like to make the point that Australia is being represented here in a neutral manner. With that in mind, we'll be moving along to the next piece. The headline reads: Australia's laser attack fault-finding farce copies the US, according to the Global Times editorial. Published February 22, 2022 at 12:56 a.m. The opening paragraph of the article reads: In regard to Australia's hype of a Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, Navy vessel pointing a laser at an Australian patrol aircraft, here comes the truth. It was the villain, Australia, sued its victims. an Australian defense plane made dangerous moves towards a Chinese naval vessel, but Australia turned around and blamed China. However, such a move is consistent with Australia's character. On Monday, the spokesman of China's Ministry of Defense said that the Australian P-8 anti-submarine patrol aircraft operated near the Chinese vessel flotilla with a minimum distance of only 4 kilometers. The Chinese vessels were sailing normally in international waters, which conform to the relevant international laws and international practices. Against this backdrop, the fact that an Australian P-8 anti-submarine patrol aircraft came within only 4 kilometers from Chinese ships for surveillance was highly provocative. Worse still, the Australian plane also dropped sonar buoys around Chinese ships. Such a move means it was preparing to detect if there were Chinese submarine activities and possibly force PLA submarines, if there were any, to surface. This went far beyond the scope of unprofessional and became a practice of military hostility. Such a malicious and provocative behavior could easily lead to misunderstanding and misjudgment, threatening the vessels, the aircraft, and the safety of the personnel on both sides. In the face of such malicious provocations, China maintained safe, standard, and professional actions throughout the process and did not take the initiative to announce the ugly actions of the Australian patrol aircraft to the international community. Instead, China chose to keep a low profile and remain restrained. This is China's goodwill toward regional stability as a responsible major country. However, Australia has been slandering China without telling the full story. Australia has played the trick of a thief, crying to stop a thief to the utmost. The key information China released was missing from the statement of the Australian Defence Department or from the remarks of Prime Minister Scott Morrison or Defence Minister Peter Dutton. They just repeatedly claimed that a Chinese Navy ship fired a laser at an Australian surveillance aircraft and that the Australian government would always stand up to China's coercion, apologies, bullying and intimidation. These remarks show the persecutory decisions. Morrison in particular seemed extremely frantic. He spoke out on the matter for 2 days in a row, each time more vehemently, demanding a full investigation from Beijing. He also put forward an inconceivable hypothesis that if an Australian frigate points a laser at a Chinese surveillance aircraft in the Taiwan Strait, could you imagine their reaction to that in Beijing? This provocative analogy was in fact a sensational campaign stunt designed to play the anti-China card with the opposition Labour Party and to compete with his opponent Dutton, who is better at political hype as the general election is approaching, completely disregarding the truth, let alone justice. Australia has shown such a high profile without much self-awareness in recent years, as if it is no longer a good US lackey if it does not do so. Australia established an AUKUS alliance with the US and the UK last year, preparing to build and deploy a fleet of nuclear submarines with long-range capability. It also touted Australia must also be prepared to send off yet again our warriors to fight. Its warships, have also frequently swaggered in the South China Sea from time to time, and they claimed to attempt to break into waters within 12 nautical miles around Chinese islands and reefs. Australia's military ambitions are expanding like never before, and as a result, the farce of bullying others by flaunting his powerful connection often appears. It is now clear that Australia's claim that its patrol plane was fired at with laser light by a Chinese naval vessel is nothing but a fault-finding farce directed and performed by Australia itself. Of course, this is not Australia's own creation. The US had been embarrassed by China several times in this regard. Australia even copied the US on how to find fault with China. Australia deserves its title as an anti-China vanguard of the US, and meanwhile it showed the international community who is the destabilizing factor in the region. As for Morrison's so-called intimidation from the Chinese side, what he needs to do now is not to seize the microphone of the media, but to tell his defense minister that only by following the rules can there be safety. This is a pretty loaded article with tons of subtext. I think from the outset, through the header and the title, it's pretty clear that this is an example of a othering offensive taking place, constructing and representing Australia in not only a negative light, but a repulsive one, maintaining its position of describing Australia as one of the anti-China vanguards of the US. With that said, we'll move along to the next piece. This article comes with the headline, GT Voice: Cold War mentality will cost Australia economic growth. Published February 23rd, 2022 at 8:15 p.m. The opening paragraph of the article reads, "It seems that France's grudge against Australia for suffering the collateral loss of the latter's AUKUS deal with the UK and the US is likely to generate more long-term consequences than first expected. France removed Australia from its list of close strategic partners in an updated version of its official Indo-Pacific strategy, as tensions between the two countries remains since their AUKUS clash in September," The Independent reported on Wednesday. Australia's decision has led to a re-evaluation of the past strategic partnership between the two countries, the French government said, adding it would now cooperate with Australia on a case-by-case basis. While Australia's geographical location or position may make it look like a natural partner for those eyeing the Indo-Pacific, France's decision to dump Australia as a strategic partner clearly indicates that its role is not indispensable to the regional strategy if Canberra only cares about how to maintain its relationship with the US. And given the fact that France is one of the major powers in Europe and has dominant influence within the EU, France's continuing anger towards Canberra doesn't bode well for the latter's potential cooperation with Europe. Politicians in Canberra may tell their people they have proved their ideological values by being high note and pursuing an anti-China stance, but what they won't tell them is that there is an increasingly narrow window of opportunity for Australia to engage with global economic cooperation, thanks to their recklessness and short-sightedness. Over the years, Australia's hostility toward China has seriously damaged its relationship with China, and its betrayal over submarines with France has poisoned its ties with Paris. The confusing aspect is that Australia has not followed its own interests, but instead chosen to pander to the US. It is Canberra's wishful thinking to believe the US would help it recover the losses incurred by their provocations against important trading partners. If they don't take their own interests seriously, why should anyone else care? From the perspective of Australia's long-term development strategy, it cannot always follow the US, being sided with it, which will deprive it of many development opportunities. If Canberra wants to play a major role in the Asia-Pacific or even a greater role globally, so as to benefit its economy, it cannot continue with its Cold War mentality and roping in allies to attack others. If Canberra continues to follow the US and choose potential partners based solely on ideological bias, then the country will lose much of the opportunities when it comes to global cooperation with others, especially with China. Against the backdrop of the global action against climate change, Australia's resource industries are facing an arduous transition that could be both difficult and expensive if the country does not have the opportunity to be extensively engaged in global cooperation. the transition will face more uncertainties on the road. That is the strategic choice facing all Australians who still have the time to change course. But the key is whether politicians in Canberra have the political wisdom to make the right choice. Based on this initial first impression, I think it's pretty clear that there is a clear instance of constructing Australia as a negative and repulsive other. And beyond that, I suppose the subtext would suggest it is also attempting to drive a domestic political wedge within Australia itself. With that said, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 23rd of February by the author Xiao Xin is the headline, "Prominence in Rare Metals Production Won't Be Dented by Biden's Cheap Talk." This is found in the economy section of the Global Times. The opening paragraph of the article reads, "In a fresh move, framed by Joe Biden as not anti-China, but pro-America, the US leader on Tuesday touted domestic efforts to cut into China's electric battery dominance that center around mining and processing key minerals including lithium and rare earth metals." Let's take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it looks like it appears once in the article. Let's take a closer look. In his remarks at the Tuesday virtual event on securing critical minerals, Biden said that US demand for lithium, graphite, and rare earth materials is expected to increase by 400 to 600% in the next several decades. Biden said resignedly, however, "Up to now, we've had to import a significant portion of them, close to 100% importation from other countries, particularly China, Australia, and Chile." No further mentions of Australia is found in the article, and based on this first impression, I'll make the point that Australia is represented here in a neutral manner. With that said, we can move on to the next piece. This article comes with the title or headline, "The United Nations Warns of Extreme Wildfires, with over 31% increase in deadly events expected by 2099. This was originally published by the AFP and published February 23rd, 2022 at 5:48 p.m. in the Global Times section, Eye on World. The article is accompanied by a photograph with the following captions: "Firefighters battle ablaze in Athens, Greece on August 23rd, 2021. The opening paragraph of the article reads, "The number of major wildfires worldwide will rise sharply in coming decades due to global warming, and governments are ill prepared for the death and destruction such mega blazes trail in their wake," the UN warned Wednesday. Even the most ambitious efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions will not prevent a dramatic surge in the frequency of extreme fire conditions, a report commissioned by the UN Environment Programme concluded. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it looks like it's gonna appear once, twice, 3 times. Let's take a closer look. By the end of the century, the probability of wildfire events similar to Australia's 2019 to 2020 Black Summer, or the huge Arctic fires in 2020 occurring in a given year, is likely to increase by 31 to 57%. Beyond that, Australia is also mentioned again in the following paragraph. Nearly 3 billion mammals, reptiles, birds and frogs were killed or harmed, for example, by Australia's devastating 2019 to 2020 bushfires, scientists have calculated. Wildfires are made worse by climate change. Heat waves, drought conditions, and reduced soil moisture, amplified by global warming, have contributed to unprecedented fires in the western US, Australia, and the Mediterranean basin just in the last 3 years. Based on this initial impression, one might make the argument that Australia is represented here in a factual way, and I think this would sit within a construction that's painting Australia in a neutral light. We'll move along to the next piece. Published on the 23rd of February by the author Deng Xiaoqi, the Global Times reporter tracking China's space programs and cutting-edge science and technology projects. The headline of the article reads, Indian media sow discord with maritime roadmap hype against China. This is found in the diplomacy section of the Global Times. The article is accompanied by a photograph whose captions read, this handout photo released by the Indian Navy on October 12, 2020 shows ships during the second phase of the Malabar naval exercise in which India, Australia, Japan, and the US are taking part in the Bay of Bengal in the Indian Ocean. The opening paragraph states, the newly signed roadmap by India and France on the blue economy and ocean governance has been, not surprisingly, hyped by some nationalist Indian media outlets as Delhi's latest efforts to counter so-called China's aggressive policies in the Indo-Pacific region, which are seen by Chinese analysts as another shameless attempt to smear China. The roadmap issued during the foreign minister's visit to Paris has been accompanied by groundless accusations against Beijing, such as a debt trap of China, proposed Belt and Road Initiative, and the country's illegal fishing around India, Indian local media reported. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it looks like it will be appearing once, and it did show up in the earlier captions. Based on this initial impression, one might make the argument that Australia is not exactly represented in a positive light, but rather bundled together as part of the Quad. So in that sense, I think, without being too directly and overtly painting Australia as negative, this would sit as a somewhat negative representation of Australia. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 24th of February. This next piece has the headline, Cynics Seeking Validation Left Disappointed as Beijing 2022 Concludes Successfully. Written by Robert Walker, February 24th, 2022 at 11:18 p.m. This is found in the Viewpoint section of the Global Times. The article is accompanied by a photograph with the following captions. Members of Team China wave during the opening ceremony of the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics at the Beijing National Stadium on February the 4th, 2022 in Beijing, China. The opening paragraph reads, only a few months ago, some critics were casting doubt on the viability of the scheduled 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. In the weeks and months preceding the Winter Games, there was a concerted effort in some Western countries and diplomatic circles to organize a boycott. In the US, Nikki Haley, the former American envoy to the United Nations, joined a chorus of politicians calling for the US to boycott the Games. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it appears once in the article, and this is what it says. In the end, only 10 countries, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, India, Lithuania, Kosovo, Belgium, Denmark, and Estonia, declared a diplomatic boycott, meaning they would not send any government ministers to attend, though their athletes still competed. The small number of non-participating governments could not contain the energy and dynamism of the athletes, nor that of the participants from throughout the world. Based on this impression, I think it's fair to say Australia is not exactly represented in a positive light because a line in the sand has been drawn. So where would this sit? I think this would be a negative representation of Australia. We will move along to the next article. Published on the 24th of February is this headline: Winter Olympics start new era for spread of Chinese culture. The subheader reads, Friendly Confident Olympics host denies aggressive image. Written by the Global Times staff reporters. This was found in the China/Society section of the Global Times. The article is accompanied by a photograph with the following captions: Closing ceremony of Beijing 2022 Olympic Winter Games at National Stadium in Beijing on February 20th, 2022. The opening paragraph reads, The Beijing Winter Olympics had ended, yet the unique Chinese romance left by the event still lingers, with international and Chinese culture experts sharing their belief that just like the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics, this edition of the Winter Olympics will be another key point for Chinese culture to be further communicated to the world. But some media and politicians in the West who have remained vigilant about China's growing influence will spare no effort to ring-fence it. However, the harmonious, peaceful and loving signals sent by this Winter Olympics will help counter this myth of China as an aggressive power, as some have alleged. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia in the article, and it appears here in the following paragraph. Take this Winter Olympics. According to a survey conducted by China News Service this week, which included respondents from countries such as the US, UK, Russia, Australia, and Japan, 73.2% of respondents said they paid attention to the Winter Olympics and that a majority expressed their willingness to visit China and get a deeper understanding of the country. Australia is mentioned once again in a following paragraph. I'll be backtracking one paragraph before just to provide a little bit more context. So they appear under the section Challenges to China's Image. And the paragraph reads, The road for Chinese culture to reach a wide overseas public hasn't been smooth. Many foreign media and Western institutes tend to be negative when reporting about this edition of the Winter Olympics. For example, a research staff at the US-funded Australian-based think tank SKA, or the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, also took it to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics mascot Bing Duan Duan and used it as a tool in criticizing Chinese propaganda and information operations. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that the article is a little bit more than meets the eye. What seemed like a positive representation before has now been attenuated into one that I will believe is negative. In fact, it's clearly said over here in the paragraph itself. With that in mind, we'll move along to the next article. Entitled, No Full Recovery Until 2024, Dubai Airport's Chief. This article was originally published by the AFP, Feb 24 at 7:02 p.m. This is found in the travel/gallery section of the Global Times. The article is accompanied with a photograph with the following captions. Travelers wait with their luggage pieces at Dubai International Airport on February 21st, 2022. The opening paragraph reads, Passenger traffic at Dubai International Airport, the world's busiest, will not recover to pre-COVID-19 levels before 2024, its CEO told AFP. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and Australia appears once in the following paragraph. He said an easing of restrictions in the Asia-Pacific region, where Australia reopened its borders to vaccinated tourists this week, would fuel the recovery. No further mentions of Australia is found in this article, and based on this initial impression, one might say that Australia is represented in more than just a neutral light, maybe a little tinge of positivity. I think this will sit between the two, neutral to somewhat positive. With that said, we'll move along to the next article. Entitled, Fortress Australia reopens to tourists after 2 years COVID-19 closure. Comes with the subheader, A Slow Reboot Down Under. This was published originally by the AFP in the Global Times in its travel/gallery section. The article is accompanied with a photograph of which its captions read, Passengers make their way out upon arrival at the Sydney International Airport on February 21st, 2022, as Australia reopened its borders for fully vaccinated visa holders, tourists, and business travellers. The opening paragraph reads, Jubilant visitors returned to Australia on Monday as the country reopened its borders to vaccinated tourists nearly 2 years after the island nation imposed some of the world's strictest COVID-19 travel restrictions. At the country's two major international airports in Sydney and Melbourne, tired but elated family and friends rushed from gates to embrace loved ones after years apart. Bernie Edmonds was emotional as he hugged his 8-year-old granddaughter Charlotte, who had just landed in Sydney. We'll take a closer look at further mentions of Australia in the article, and it appears a number of times. Let's take a closer look. The national carrier expects to bring more than 14,000 passengers into Australia this week, the start of what many believe will be a long, slow recovery for a tourism sector devastated by the pandemic. I think we're going to see a very, very strong rebound, Tourism Minister Dan Tehan said at Sydney Airport, wearing a t-shirt with the words, Welcome back. Attracting tourists from China, previously Australia's biggest market, would be difficult while Beijing enforces a zero-virus policy, Tehan admitted. But as soon as that changes, Tourism Australia have been doing a lot of work to make sure that we will be ready to encourage those Chinese visitors to come. The Australian government has launched a $40 million campaign to lure tourists back, but only 56 international flights are scheduled to land in the country in the 24 hours after the reopening, far below pre-pandemic levels. In this instance, I believe the article is a little bit more than meets the eye. On the outset, it might seem like it's taking on a neutral tone, but the closer I look, the more I'm inclined to go with there is a very subtle hint of negative in the article, despite the fact this was published originally by the AFP. So with the section header Fortress Australia, this next paragraph reads, Every month under Fortress Australia has cost businesses an estimated $3.6 billion according to the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, with tourism particularly hard hit. With that said, we'll move along to the next article. Published on February 24th, 2022 at 6:20 p.m, originally by the AFP. This article's headline reads, Australia's gas and mining emissions higher than estimated, according to a report. The opening paragraph reads, Gas and mining projects in Australia are emitting significantly more greenhouse gases than their operators promised, with an environmental group reporting Thursday that one pipeline was releasing 20 times the initial estimate. During an 18-month investigation, researchers from the Australian Conservation Foundation found 1 in 5 fossil fuel companies reporting their emissions had exceeded the amount approved by the government. One gas pipeline in the state of Queensland, operated by Origin Energy, has released 2,000% over the amount it predicted before the project was approved. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia in the article, and it will appear a number of times. We'll have a closer look at the following paragraph. Meanwhile, Chevron's Gorgon LNG project off Australia's west coast was found to have emitted double the emissions initially promised. It also appears in the final paragraph of the article, and that reads, as part of its investigation, the Australian Conservation Fund also looked at emissions from coal mines and found a similar pattern of underestimation. Based on this initial impression, one can make the argument that Australia is not exactly represented in any way, shape or form in a positive light, so I think this sits quite clearly as a negative construction of Australia. We'll move along to the next piece. Published on February 24th, 2022 at 12:11 a.m. is the following headline: Business Quick Take: Why China firmly opposes economic sanctions against Russia. This was found in the Source/Economy section of the Global Times, and it's accompanied by a photograph with the following captions. Photo taken on December 3rd, 2021 shows St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, Russia. The opening paragraph of the article reads, since tensions started to escalate on the Russia-Ukraine border and the war-mongering media hype in the US intensified, many journalists, observers and officials around the world were keen to hear about China's stance on the unfolding security crisis in Europe. On Tuesday, Chinese officials presented China's position, calling on all parties to exercise restraint and resolve differences through dialogue and negotiation. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it appears once. And this paragraph reads, following earlier sanctions against the two regions, US President Joe Biden on Tuesday announced new measures targeting Russian banks and restricting Russia's access to financial markets. Many US allies, including Canada, Australia, and Japan, have also announced various sanctions against Russia. Meanwhile, Biden has threatened more crippling sanctions if Russia goes further with this invasion. The following paragraph reads, while some in the US appear to be claiming victory over what US officials and media outlets describe as swift and severe actions against Russia, those sanctions also affect others, potentially including businesses and consumers in the US and its allies, even if the cost is not evident immediately. Based on this initial impression, one might make the argument that Australia in this case is being constructed as negative. As you can see in some of the following paragraphs, you have Hua Chunying, spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, expressing China's consistent position, which is opposing all of these illegal unilateral sanctions. By bunching Australia together with that line in the sand, one might make the argument that Australia in this case is being represented and constructed as somewhat negative to negative. We'll move along to the next article. The next piece is entitled Russia Ready to Talk After Militarily Paralyzing Ukraine in Hours, written by Chen Qingqing, co-leader of the Global Times China desk, Wang Wenwen, chief reporter of the Global Times and also commentator on US politics and Asian security, and Cui Fanti, published February 25th, 2022 at 12:37 a.m. This was found in the World/Europe section of the Global Times. The article is accompanied by a photograph with the following captions. Black smoke rises from a military airport near Kharkiv on February 24th, 2022, after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a military operation in Ukraine. The opening paragraph. As some local residents began fleeing Kiev early Thursday morning and rushing west while air raid sirens sounded in the Ukrainian capital, fears of war have grown palpably, catching global media attention and sending the world's markets tumbling shortly after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a military operation in the Donbas region. As world leaders reacted to the quickly escalating Ukraine-Russia crisis, China once again called on the relevant parties to remain restrained and prevent the situation from sliding out of control. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it appears once in the following paragraph. Dark day for Europe was how some Western media and politicians described the situation, and countries including the US, Germany, UK, and Australia criticized the Russian government move. The US and its allies are poised to unveil further sweeping sanctions against Russia, with US President Joe Biden calling the military operation an unprovoked and unjustified attack. However, in the eyes of Putin and most Russians, the latest move serves as a counterstrike against the Western squeezing of Russia's security room with extreme measures and a relatively large-scale showdown in wrestling with the US, a view that is also shared by the majority of Chinese, according to this article from the Global Times. Based on this initial impression, I think it's a little bit more than meets the eye. I think underlying the message behind how Australia is positioned in this article, it is certainly being constructed as negative and being on the other side of the fence. We'll move along to the next article. Published on February 27th is the following article. Ukraine situation threatens NEV battery production, by the Global Times' staff reporters, published at 7:52 p.m. This is found in the source/economy section of the Global Times. The article is accompanied by a photograph with the following captions. Photo taken on November 11th shows a copper-nickel sculpture depicting a panorama of the Forbidden City made by renowned artist Li Xiangqun. The sculpture is currently being exhibited at the Palace Museum in Beijing. It will also be displayed at other museums in Shanghai and other countries once the Beijing exhibition closes. Photo by Du Yang by China News Services. The opening paragraph of this article reads, "The Russia-Ukraine conflict has sent the prices of aluminium and nickel to decade highs, causing concern over tight supply chains amid a recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as threats to power batteries for new energy vehicles, also known as NEVs, which require nickel as an integral raw material, according to analysts. Europe may suffer the most if Western countries put sanctions on Russia's nickel production or trade, although this is unlikely to happen because Europe is the biggest buyer of Russian nickel." Chen Ruirui, an analyst specializing in nickel at metal consultancy Antaike, I'm not sure if I get the pronunciation of that correct at all, told the Global Times on Sunday. Let's take a closer look at another mention of Australia. And it looks like it appears once in the following paragraph. Just to build up the context a little bit more, the previous paragraph reads, Russia accounted for around 7% of global nickel output and 18% of China's nickel imports, according to Chen. But China's nickel imports from Russia were mainly in the form of nickel plates for stainless steel and alloy production instead of NEV batteries, she added. The buoyant NEV market in China has brought hot demand for nickel, but the nickel in Chinese NEV power batteries is mainly imported from Australia, Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia, and Indonesia. So the Russian-Ukraine conflict will not cripple China's NEV supply chains, Chen said, while underscoring nickel's strategic significance globally. Based on this initial impression, I think I'll make the argument that Australia is represented here in a neutral manner. Maybe slightly coming in with positive undertones. Something I'll definitely have to revisit. For now, just going to categorize it as neutral. We'll move along to the next article. The next article is entitled How Cultural Exchanges Have Brought People from China and the US Closer, with the subheader The Bonds of Friendship. This was written by Du Qiongfang, February 27th, 2022 at 6:26 p.m. in the live/culture section of the Global Times. The opening line of the article reads, "It is said that culture and art can help develop political relations among nations. It has been indeed earnestly practiced by cultural and art professionals who have been endeavoring to build bridges between China and the US since the ice-breaking visit of US President Richard Nixon to China in 1972. The article is accompanied by an image, a photograph, with the following captions. The Shanghai Symphony Orchestra performs at the Jaguar Shanghai Symphony Hall in Shanghai on February 26, 2022. We'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia, and it looks like it appears once in the article, and it reads, awarded the Lumiere Award, the film was screened in a slew of overseas countries including France, the UK, Japan, Australia, and Italy. And just to provide a bit more context, what came in the paragraph before is as follows. Years later, when Teng brought his movie Farewell My Concubine, the Beijing Opera, China's first film of a Peking opera performance, presented with 3D/panoramic and Dolby Atmos surround sound technology, to the Dolby Theatre in Los Angeles in 2014, he successfully presented a new image of China while also promoting traditional Chinese culture. Following on from that, awarded the Lumiere Award, the film was screened in a slew of overseas countries including France, the UK, Japan, Australia, and Italy. Based on this initial impression, I think I would fit this article within the category of neutral, maybe somewhat positive. Something to revisit at a later stage, but for now, we'll keep going on. Published on February 27th, 2022 at 5:57 p.m. This next article was found in the World/Asia Pacific section of the Global Times with the following title/headline. Australia floods kill 7 as severe weather pummels Queensland. Originally from Reuters, and it's accompanied by a photograph of a market in Queensland, Australia. And the opening paragraph of the article reads, the death toll from flash flooding in Australia's northeast rose to 7 on Sunday as a severe storm system pummeled the city of Brisbane and the southeast of the state of Queensland. We'll take a closer look at the rest of the article, and looks like it is a report on the state of emergency that's currently gripping not just people across Queensland, but is now spread into the New South Wales. Based on this initial impression, it looks like it is delivering information, and for that reason, I think I'll put this under the category of neutral. With that said, we'll move along to the next article. Published originally by the AFP, February 27th, 2022 at 5:37 p.m. This article comes with the headline, England Captain Root Grateful to Survive Ashes Cull. It appears in the Sport/Miscellany section of the Global Times, and we'll take a closer look at mentions of Australia. It looks like it appears once in the article, and it shows up in paragraph number 2. A humiliating 4-0 reverse in Australia saw England Director of Cricket Ashley Giles, head coach Chris Silverwood, and batting coach Graham Thorpe, all sacked. Have a closer look at the rest of the article, and looks like it is a report on a series of games. Based on this initial impression, I think Australia is represented here in a neutral, if not somewhat. I'm not sure if there's any other way to read this. I think I'll stand by that. Australia is represented here in a neutral manner. Certainly worth revisiting at a later stage. But for now, we'll keep going to the next article from the Global Times. And this would be the final one for the week, from Monday 21st of February, running through to Sunday the 27th of February 2022. Entitled A Taste of Chinese Culture at Australian University. Originally published by Xinhua, this was found in the Photo/World section of the Global Times. A number of photos are in display, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're accompanied by the following captions. Photo taken on February 26, 2022 shows a Lunar New Year celebration, which was held including lion dance performances at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. You also have photographs showing the Chinese ambassador to Australia at the celebration at the Australian National University. A photograph of a waist drum dance. Photograph of a performance. And based on this initial impression, the first article from Sky News Australia, published February 21st, 2022, with the headline, Scott Morrison demands answers from Beijing after China warship pointed laser at Australian pilot. The subheader reads, China has refused to explain how one of its warships pointed a laser at an Australian surveillance plane, while Scott Morrison has condemned Beijing for the dangerous and reckless act. Written by Tyrone Clark. The article has an accompanying video, which is 2 minutes and 44 seconds in length, with the title, Chinese Laser Attacked, an Act of Intimidation, says PM. The opening paragraph of the article reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has called for a full investigation into the dangerous and reckless act involving a Chinese warship pointing a laser at an Australian military plane. A surveillance flight off the coast of Australia's Northern Reach was targeted by a People's Liberation Army Navy vessel on Thursday, which the Defense Department described as a serious safety incident. The Prime Minister immediately called for answers on the weekend, accused the Communist government of intimidation. There is a further video attached to the article, 1 minute and 38 seconds in length, entitled Chinese Laser Attack, Part of a Long-Term Pattern of Intimidation. Following on from that, Mr. Morrison said on Monday he had not yet received any communication from Beijing, but was pushing for a full investigation. We haven't received an explanation as yet, but what we've called for, working through the diplomatic and defense channels, is a full investigation into this event and for them to provide answers to how this dangerous act could be undertaken, he told 2GB's Band Forum. For what is supposed to be a professional defense force, this is a dangerous and reckless, and worse, it can be seen, as I said yesterday, as an act of intimidation and bullying. They were in our exclusive economic zone and they were pointing a laser at an Australian surveillance aircraft. Mr. Morrison said the actions by the Chinese vessel was a direct threat on the pilot's life. If you go and point lasers in the eyes of pilots, then that is a direct threat to them and their safety. It is a reckless and dangerous act, he said. It comes after a week where the government attempted to shift the national conversation to defense and security, while framing the Labour Party as weak on China. A further video is accompanying this article, and it's entitled "China Threat Needs to be Taken Very Seriously," and it's 6 minutes and 59 seconds in length. Moving along the article, Canberra's relations with Beijing have significantly worsened since Mr. Morrison called for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, to which China reacted with trade restrictions. The Defense Department said this latest act of aggression had the potential to endanger lives and hit out at the PLA. We strongly condemn unprofessional and unsafe military conduct, it said in a statement. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that China is represented and constructed in a negative light. We move along to the next piece. Published on February 21st at 1:55 p.m., this article has the following headline: China suggests Australia is to blame for laser attack on surveillance plane. China has sensationally responded to claims one of its warships flashed a laser at a surveillance plane, suggesting Australia was to blame. Written by Tyrone Clark with 46 comments. Let's take a closer look at the article. The article is accompanied by a video, 2 minutes and 2 seconds in length, entitled "Global Times Tortures Australia for Trying to Throw Mud at China." The opening paragraph of the article reads, "Beijing's propaganda mouthpiece has blamed Australia for a Chinese warship flashing a laser at an Australian plane and criticized the government for false mud throwing. A surveillance flight off the coast of Australia's Northern Reach was targeted by a PLA Navy vessel on Thursday, which the Defense Department described as a serious safety incident. However, the Global Times have said, and they have a citation drawing the reader back to their page, and let's go and have a look. With the headline, Australia's accusations of PLA vessels laser deployment, false mud throwing at China. The article, Sky News Australia relates, suggested Australia's outrage at the incident was an attempt to throw mud at China, despite the Defense Department declaring the actions could have the potential to endanger lives. The Global Times quoted a Chinese military expert and TV commentator who claimed the plane was conducting a close-in reconnaissance. The article has another accompanying video, 2 minutes and 44 seconds in length, entitled "Chinese Laser Attack, an Act of Intimidation," says the PM. In the next paragraph, Australia failed to tell the public how close its aircraft flew near the Chinese vessels, so people could not tell if the Chinese vessels were forced to take defensive countermeasures, Song Zhongping said. A separate analyst told the Global Times that the laser was purely equipped as a rangefinder to tell distances between objects and denied that they pose danger to targets. The Global Times has often served as the mouthpiece for the regime in Beijing, and this latest response is China's first public statement on the incident. Prime Minister Scott Morrison demanded answers from China on the weekend and again on Monday, when he said he would push for a full investigation into the matter through diplomatic and defense channels. Mr. Morrison blasted the act as dangerous and reckless, and an act of intimidation on the part of China. For what is supposed to be a professional defense force, this is a dangerous and reckless act, and worse, it can be seen, as I said yesterday, as an act of intimidation and bullying, Mr. Morrison told 2GB's Ben Fordham. Another accompanying video, 6 minutes and 59 seconds in length, accompanies the article with the title, China Threat Needs to be Taken Very Seriously. If you go point lasers in the eyes of pilots, then there's a direct threat to them and their safety. It is a dangerous and reckless act. From this initial impression, I think it's pretty clear that Sky News Australia is constructing China in a negative light. We'll move along to the next article. Published February 21st, 2022 at 3:09 p.m. comes this article found in the World News section of Sky News Australia's website. So there is a single paragraph in here describing the video, which is entitled Global Times Tortures Australia for Trying to Throw Mud at China. The paragraph reads, China's mouthpiece, the Global Times, has accused Australia of attempting to throw mud at the country following Canberra's anger over a Chinese warship, I'm not sure if that was a spelling mistake, pointing a laser at an Australian military plane. Based on this initial impression, one might make the argument that China is not exactly represented in a positive light, and a very clear line in the sand is being drawn between the two parties. We'll move along to the next piece. Found in the politics section of Sky News Australia, this next headline reads, Chris Min's defense trip to China funded by exiled Chinese billionaire Huang Xiaomo. New South Wales Labour leader Chris Minns says he wishes he had changed many things after it was revealed his trip to China was funded by billionaire Huang Xiaomo, who was exiled from Australia as an agent of influence. Written by Crystal Wu, and the article is accompanied with a video 36 seconds in length entitled New South Wales Labour leader's China trip funded by exiled billionaire. The opening paragraph of the article reads, New South Wales Labour leader Chris Minns has defended his trip to China, which was funded by exiled Chinese billionaire Huang Xiaomo in 2015. Mr. Minns said he had no knowledge of Mr. Huang's involvement with the Chinese Communist Party until he became a subject of an independent commission against corruption, ICAC investigation, in 2019. If you look back at it in reverse, I'd wished I would changed many things, he told 2GB Radio on Tuesday. I mean, the thing that irritates me the most is that people think I would hide this trip. Obviously I wouldn't. It was a very important partner of Australia. The New South Wales Labour leader said it was his understanding that the trip to Hong Kong and China with Labour Energy spokesperson Chris Bowen and his wife was funded by the Australia Guangdong Chamber of Commerce. But he had no knowledge that Mr. Huang, who fronted the Chamber of Commerce, was under the suspicion of making political donations on behalf of the Chinese government. There are two accompanying photographs, the first of which comes with the following captions. Chris Minns said he understood the trip was funded by the Australia Guangdong Chamber of Commerce, and a following photograph with Huang Xiaomo exiled by ASIO on suspicion of making political donations on behalf of the Chinese government. The next paragraph states the billionaire property developer donated at least $2.7 million to both major political parties, including $100,000 of cash in an Aldi bag to the Labour Party headquarters. I certainly had no knowledge of those allegations and only became aware of them when the ICAC conducted an inquiry, he said. Mr. Min said the trip was almost exclusively about trade and that he has not been in touch with Mr. Huang since. I had no reason to believe that anyone else was funding the trip. It may well be the case that Huang Xiaomo was funding it, but I didn't know that then, and certainly don't know that now. There's another accompanying video in the article with the title New South Wales Labour Party Donation Scandal. It's year in review, and the video is 3 minutes and 1 second long. As far as I knew, the relationship with China was important. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I thought it was being funded by the Guangdong Chamber of Commerce. That was my belief at that time. If that's not the case, I'm obviously prepared to cop that, but that's my honest understanding at the time. Based on this initial impression, one might even paint China as something sinister, and for that reason, I would make the argument that this is constructing China in a negative light. We'll move along to the next piece. Found in the Global Affairs section of Sky News Australia, this next headline reads, Morrison calls on China to denounce Russia's actions. Published February 23rd, 2022 at 1:33 p.m. The article is accompanied with a video 1 minute and 10 seconds in duration, and the opening paragraph of the article reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison says he hopes China joins other nations in condemning Russia's actions. I'll welcome them going the full distance and joining ourselves and the United States and the UK and the EU, Canada, and so many other countries that are denouncing what is occurring there, Mr. Morrison said. So based on this initial impression, this description, of course, will be prompting the audience or reader to check out the 1 minute and 10 second long video. I would like to make the argument that this is based on the text alone, presenting China in a somewhat awkward position, yes, but in terms of its tonality, I think it is representing China in a neutral manner. It's posing China a question and awaiting its response. So for that reason, I think this would be neutral. Moving along to the next article. Published February 23rd, this article has the headline, Scott Morrison urges China to join the West in condemning Russia over Ukraine invasion. With the subheading, After 2 years of diplomatic tit-for-tat, Scott Morrison has extended an olive branch to China, urging Beijing to join the West in condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Written by Tyrone Clark. The article has 12 comments, and it's accompanied with a video 1 minute and 10 seconds in duration. The opening paragraph of the article reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has made an embattled plea to China for cooperation to prevent any further destruction in Ukraine at the hands of a thuggish Russia. Mr. Morrison said he hoped China would join Australia in coming out against Vladimir Putin's invasion. I hope they, China, join us, the Prime Minister said in a bid to mend 2 years of extended hostilities between Canberra and Beijing. That is the message that I'm sending and have been sending for some time. China's language in the course of the past week has improved. We welcome them going the full distance and joining ourselves and the United States and the UK and EU and Canada and so many other countries in the denouncing of what is occurring there. The article is accompanied with another video, 6 minutes and 9 seconds in duration, entitled China is Fighting the West on the movie screen. Moving along the article, the next paragraph reads, The Prime Minister has been in the middle of a heated diplomatic and trade row with China since he called for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 in Wuhan in April 2020. Beijing swiftly responded in what would be the first of many trade actions against Australian exporters, slapping a massive 80.5% tariff on Aussie barley. Shortly after, China's Education Ministry warned its students they could face racist incidents in Australia, with similar warnings spreading from its culture and tourism industry. China rapidly began scaling back purchases of Australian coal, cotton, lobster and beef, and as well as wine, on which it later placed a tariff of up to 200%. In November 2020, the embassy in Canberra released a list of 14 grievances which it demanded Australia address to mend the relationship, including retracting the call for the COVID-19 inquiry, reversing a ban on Huawei, and overturning foreign interference legislation. The relationship continued to sour throughout 2021 when Australia launched action against China at the World Trade Organization. Canberra also began a diplomatic communication freeze with all senior ministers in Canberra. And while Russia and China recently launched a new alliance, Beijing has urged restraint over the Kremlin's recent moves in eastern Ukraine. The Chinese Foreign Ministry on Tuesday said all parties need to de-escalate the situation and resolve differences through dialogue and negotiation. It comes after President Putin quickly deployed troops on peacekeeping operations in eastern Ukraine hours after recognizing the independence of the separatist regions in Donetsk and Luhansk. No further mentions of China in the text edition of the report. Of course, the article is also accompanied by another video. If Ukraine doesn't fight Russia, Putin gets a cost-free victory. Based on that initial impression, text only, it looks like Australia,
I hope they join us,
representing and constructing China in a somewhat positive light. Although that's probably more than meets the eye, but I think that would fit for now. Published on the 25th of February, this next headline reads: Peter Dutton urges Chinese President Xi Jinping to call ally Vladimir Putin to pull back soldiers in Ukraine. The subheader reads: the defense minister has asked the Chinese president to make a call to the Russian president to plead with its ally to reconsider its dreadful decision to invade Ukraine. The article is accompanied with a 5-minute and 2-second long video entitled Full-Scale War, Not in the World's Interest. The opening paragraph of the article reads: Australia's defense minister has warned China and Russia's relationship is deeply disturbing as Beijing refused to condemn the actions of its ally over its invasion into Ukraine. Peter Dutton said the world stands as one to denounce the move by Russian President Vladimir Putin, but it was tragic China had not voiced its anger over the attacks that have so far claimed at least 137 lives and injured 316. He echoed the sentiments of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who described Mr. Putin as a blood-stained dictator who has unleashed war. As we've seen this tragic circumstance unfold, we're only seeing the opening hours of the conflict that will go for some time, so the human cost will continue to rack up, and that is on President Putin, Mr. Dutton told First Edition on Friday morning. I endorse the words of President Johnson. I think it's an appalling act, and the world stands as one to condemn the actions of President Putin, except the Chinese government tragically. The defense minister stressed it was time for Chinese President Xi Jinping to pick up the phone to his ally in Mr. Putin to demand he pull back hundreds of thousands of troops scattered across multiple Ukrainian cities. Really, there's one person now, there's one world leader that's standing out from the rest, who are condemning President Putin and Vietnam's President Xi, Mr. Dutton said he has the power and the relationship to pick up the phone and to instruct him to pull back and to reconsider what is a dreadful, dreadful decision. Mr. Dutton believes the Chinese government was monitoring the Ukraine situation closely and how the world was reacting. He suggested their intelligence and information would allow them to decide what it would want to do with Taiwan, with concerns China could follow in the steps of Russia to reclaim the country. Prime Minister Scott Morrison is expected to announce further sanctions on Russia, its elites, banks, and businesses. He has spoken with allies in other countries who have condemned the actions. We are in lockstep with them and many other countries beyond our traditional allies in terms of those sanctions and those surrounding him. There is a significant economic price to pay, Mr. Dutton said. There is another accompanying video to the article entitled "World Leaders Condemn Barbaric Russian Attack on Ukraine." Moving along the article, the next paragraph reads, Australia will provide a significant medical and humanitarian response to Ukraine, with it currently unknown how long the invasion will last. Mr. Dutton conceded Russia will likely seize Ukraine. It's hard to see any other outcome. The final and concluding line of this article reads, that's what bullies do. They enter into fights with only people they know they can beat. Based on this initial impression, it's probably fair to say that there is a clear case of othering going on. Is China being represented in a negative and repulsive light? I believe that indeed is the case, and with that, we'll move along to the next article. Published on February 25th. This headline reads, Scott Morrison blasts China for easing trade restrictions with Russia and failing to denounce Ukraine invasion. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said, you don't go and throw a lifeline to Russia when it is invading another country, as he condemned China's decision to ease trade restrictions with the nation. The article is accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 19 seconds in duration entitled Australia Unleashes Further Sanctions on Russia After Brutal Invasion of Ukraine. And this is written by the digital reporter Zoe Zechak. We'll move along to the opening paragraph, and that reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has blasted China for throwing Russia a lifeline by easing trade relations or restrictions, with Moscow during Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. Mr. Morrison said he is concerned at the lack of a strong response from China in the wake of the conflict, as other major countries across the world continue to condemn the ongoing attacks and impose sanctions on Russia. The Prime Minister referred to a report in the South China Morning Post on Friday morning, which said Beijing had scrapped all wheat import restrictions on Moscow in the latest sign of deepening ties between the two powers. At a time when the world was seeking to put additional sanctions on Russia, they have eased restrictions on trade of Russian wheat into China, Mr. Morrison said. At a time when Australia, together with the United Kingdom, together with the United States and Europe and Japan, are acting to cut off Russia, the Chinese government is following through on easing trade restrictions with Russia. That is simply unacceptable. Mr. Morrison said China has indicated it would like to play a positive role in world affairs, but the latest move suggested otherwise. They say they seek peace, and I welcome those sentiments, and I welcome their comments which talk about trying to get to a position where these violent acts can cease, he said. But that said, you don't go and throw a lifeline to Russia in the middle of a period when they are invading another country. That is simply unacceptable from the reports we have seen, and I would urge all nations to say this is not a time to be easing trade relations with China. We should all be doing the exact opposite. I would call on everyone here in Australia as well as overseas to note this and urge all nations to join the sanctions against Russia. The Prime Minister also commended Australian sports people who said they would not compete in any events held in Russia this year. He believes international sporting events scheduled in Russia should be scrapped over Mr. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. Moving along the article, Defense Minister Peter Dutton on Friday warned China and Russia's relationship is deeply disturbing as Beijing refused to condemn the actions of its ally. As we've seen this tragic circumstance unfold, we're only seeing the opening hours of the conflict that will go on for some time, so the human cost will continue to rack up, and that is on President Putin. Mr. Dutton told First Edition on Friday morning, "I endorse the words of President Johnson. I think it's an appalling act, and the world stands as one to condemn the actions of President Putin, except the Chinese government tragically." The Defense Minister stressed it was time for Chinese President Xi Jinping to pick up the phone and call Mr. Putin to demand he pull back hundreds of thousands of troops scattered across multiple Ukrainian cities. Based on this initial impression, one can make the argument quite easily that China is represented in a negative manner. We'll move along to the next article. Entitled, Scott Morrison voices concern over China's lack of response on Russia-Ukraine crisis. With the subheader, Prime Minister Scott Morrison says he's concerned over China's lack of response over the Russia-Ukraine crisis, as he announced Australia will be working to provide lethal aid to Ukraine. The article, at the time of access, has 29 comments, published February 27th, 2022 at 3:50 p.m. by Krista Wu, digital reporter. The article is accompanied with a 7-minute and 55-second long video entitled Australia to Strengthen Military Support for Ukraine. The opening paragraph or line of the article reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has voiced his concern at China's lack of response over the Russian-Ukraine invasion. Speaking at a news conference on Sunday, Mr. Morrison announced Australia will be working with NATO, the United States and the United Kingdom to provide lethal aid to Ukraine in its fight against Russia. But while Western allies are joining forces to support Ukraine, China on Thursday announced its approval to import wheat from all regions of Russia, strengthening trade ties between the two countries. I particularly have been concerned at the lack of a strong response from China, Mr. Morrison said, reiterating Defense Minister Peter Dutton's criticism over Beijing's failure to respond to the attacks. At a time when the world was seeking to put additional sanctions on Russia, they eased restrictions on the trade of Russian wheat into China. At a time when Australia, together with the United Kingdom, together with the United States and Europe and Japan, are acting to cut off Russia, the Chinese government are following through on easing trade relations with Russia. That's simply unacceptable. In a tweet by Scott Morrison, a warm call with the Ukrainian PM last night, I reaffirmed Australia's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and denounced Russia's aggression. I outlined Australia's acts to sanction Russian individuals, organizations and banks. We will stand firm with Ukraine. Following on from the article, Mr. Morrison said, Australia will offer cybersecurity assistance to Ukraine to help defend against Russian cyber attacks. The Australian government will continue to stand up for what is right when it comes to Ukraine, he continued. We are already providing significant support in terms of non-lethal aid, but I've just spoken with the Defense Minister and will be seeking to provide whatever support we can for lethal aid through our NATO partners, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. We'll be working through those channels because that's the most effective way to do it. They are already providing support in those areas and we will be assisting them with what they are doing. Based on this initial impression of the article, one might make the argument that Sky News Australia rather, is constructing China in a negative manner. This concludes our look at Sky News Australia. There were 9 mentions of China during the course of the week, and that is contrasted with the 22 articles in the Global Times that had a mention of Australia in some shape, way, or form. Thank you so much for your continued support of the Australia-China Media Watch podcast. I do apologize that this episode has come in a few days after when I had initially planned for it to be ready. Please remember to tune in next time for episode 16 with some significant changes into the program in the works. Thank you so much for your support up to this point. This is the ACMW signing off for episode 15.